My name is Nancy Hatch Dupree, and I'm working with the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, which is a collection of documents related to Afghanistan.
Anyone who has been to Afghanistan in the past half-century knows the name Nancy Hatch Dupree. Nancy lived a colourful and fascinating life in Afghanistan, first as the wife of a CIA agent, and then the wife of a renowned, Harvard-educated archaeologist, Louis Dupree, with whom she spent many years travelling to archaeological sites around the country in the 1960s and 70s, writing articles and guidebooks and socializing with Kabul elites. Nancy then lost nearly everything she loved when she and Louis were kicked out of Afghanistan in 1978, and he died in 1989. She then spent the next 3 decades fighting to protect the country's rich heritage, which was devastated by war, until she passed away in 2017. I'm Eva Meharry, and in this podcast for the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University and the Afghanistan Society, I will take you through the extraordinary life of Nancy Hatch Dupree, my late mentor, by talking to some of the people who knew her best about her adventures, love, loss, and devotion to Afghan heritage. Nancy was born in New York in 1927 and then spent her earliest years in India while her father worked in agriculture for the State Department, where she learned to ride horses with the Maharaja's brother before they moved to Mexico. She would later say that she felt like she grew up on a stage set, and her later years would prove just the same. Nancy returned to New York to study art at Barnard College and then Chinese art and culture during a master's at Columbia University, where she met and fell in love with fellow student Alan Wolf. After they were married, they traveled to Iraq, Pakistan, and then Afghanistan in 1962 for Alan's job with the CIA.
She was married to Alan Wolf, the CIA great, and she went to Afghanistan as his wife.
Here's Sandra Cook, the former co-chair of the Louis and Nancy Dupree Foundation, who explained how when Nancy arrived in Kabul, she didn't want to spend her time idly playing bridge with the other diplomatic wives.
And so she wrote this book, the ATO, the Afghan Tourist Organization. They were going to take this group of important visitors to Bamiyan. So they asked her if she would write a book about it or a guide. And she said, I will. And characteristic of Nancy, she does incredible research. So she did all this research and she wrote this book. And somebody said to her, before you actually get that published for the visitors, you should take it to this guy. He's a professor. He's doing anthropological work here in Afghanistan, and have him look at it and just make sure it's okay. And she thought, well, that's a good thing. I want to make sure it's factually correct. So she took it to Louis, and he handed it back across the table to her, and he said, well, there's nothing really original here. And she said, well, I'm not writing a PhD thesis. This is a tourist guide. And she stomped out of the room, and as she tells it, he said, wait a minute. Come back here. Well, they fell in love. They had this mad affair.
I next spoke to the archaeologist Charles Kolb, who said he didn't know about the affair when he met Louis and his wife Anne and Nancy and her husband in Kabul.
Now, by the time I met everybody in 1965, this was a foursome. They were always together doing things when they were in Kabul, going to parties, going to embassy functions. And what was transpiring, I only found out about later. Louis and I went to northern Afghanistan. We were some of the first Americans allowed up there on permit because it was within the Soviet jurisdiction. The south of Afghanistan was in American jurisdiction. So the Soviets built an airport for the Afghans in Mazar-e Sharif, and the Americans countered by building the Kandahar airport in the south of Afghanistan. And so it was that kind of play. Again, it's part of the great game, actually, of the British Raj and the Russian Empire. At any rate, what was happening that I didn't know about is that Louis and Nancy began extramarital affairs. And of course, Louis and I are up there in northern Afghanistan on the Balkh River, south of Mazar-e Sharif. We're pretty well isolated. We had started to run out of supplies, so we needed to send somebody back, and that was Louis. He went back to Kabul. And it was supposed to be a quick trip to get money out of the bank and get supplies and get the alcohol that was already there at the Dupree's house and bring it up to the area of the town of Acapulco on the Balk River. And so he's gone. He's supposed to be going down, coming back. A week, tops. It turns out that he was gone for 3 weeks. But what I did not know at the time is that the Duprees and the Wolfs had decided to be divorced. And that's what would happen in January of the next year, 1966. Ultimately, Nancy and Louis got married in early February 6th. And Anne and Alan got married just after they did. So it was basically two families switching houses and switching one another because Annie was more interested in the diplomatic side and the State Department side of life, going to parties and doing all these kinds of things. Whereas Nancy and Louis were interested in the history and culture of Afghanistan. And that was a separating thing.
Louis and Nancy Dupree then became the it couple of Kabul. Here's Whitney Azoy, the anthropologist and former diplomat, who talks about his time at the Dupree's notorious 5 o'clock follies, after-work drinks which were held at their home in Kabul in the 1960s and 70s. It was an exciting time to be in Afghanistan. Visitors were flocking there along the so-called hippie trail, archaeological exploration was flourishing, and political ideas were being hotly debated amidst the Cold War, especially in 1973 when King Zahir Shah was overthrown in a bloodless coup by his cousin and former Prime Minister Daoud, who formed a republic.
He had this 5 o'clock follies, he and Nancy did later on, whereby anybody could come. It was the only open bar in Kabul. Anybody could come and anybody did, including the Afghans, including the Afghan government officials. And you'd go there and there'd be this bar, you know? And when I first came to Kabul, I was a diplomat, so it was easy to get a drink. But for a lot of people, it wasn't. And you'd go there and you'd get a drink and you get another drink and you'd start talking. Everybody would start talking. It was terrific. God, there'd be all these girls, you know, and you had a great time. And Louis and Nancy would keep serving this stuff and listening. And they closed the show and they'd sit down and write what they heard. And they'd refine those notes in the morning. And then 5 o'clock in the afternoon began all over again. I don't think no one since my first time there in the early 1970s, I don't think that anyone ever had the social reach of Louis and Nancy Dupree in Afghanistan. They knew the king, they knew Daoud, they knew members of the communist underground, which wasn't very communist and wasn't very underground, but they knew all sorts of.
Well, you know, it was its transition here, because I would have seen them on both ends of the transition from the kingdom to Daoud's republic.
Here's Marvin Weinbaum, scholar in residence at the Middle East Institute.
And I thought that the Friday meetings was really an effort to bring together the Afghan intellectuals with the foreign community. Now, wasn't a lot of people there, perhaps at any one point in time, I don't know, 15, 20 at the very most. I got to meet Afghans who I would never otherwise meet, who were all friends of Louis. He was publishing up a storm in those days. He was writing for the American University Field Staff, which he was a member of, and they stationed people all around. And so Nancy and Louis, although Louis was the person of name, they were the people there for Afghanistan and Pakistan. They living in Kabul. And that lasted until the communists came, and then threw Louis into prison for a little while.
10 years ago, I interviewed Nancy, where she talked about their transition to Pakistan after President Daoud's republic was overthrown by the communists in 1978, and the Soviets then invaded Afghanistan in 1979. She stayed in Pakistan to work with the thousands of refugees fleeing the violent fighting between the communist forces and Mujahideen resistance forces, while Louis traveled back and forth across the border with the Mujahideen.
During the Taraki regime, we were thrown out. my husband was put in jail. But then we were living in Peshawar. He was coming back with the Mujahideen. I didn't come with the Mujahideen. I thought it was not fair because, again, the Afghan character, the respect to the old lady, and think if there was a helicopter coming, he would stay in order to help me. And that was endangering his life, and I had no right to do that. So my husband, he was like a goat. He would go with the Mujahideen, they could find shelter. So he was covering the Mujahideen, I was covering the growth of the refugees in Peshawar.
I spoke to the author Ahmed Rashid about Nancy's time during the 1980s in Pakistan and the political situation there, including the Arab fighters who came to join the Mujahideen resistance against the Soviets, most notably the future leader of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden.
Nancy was very much a fixture in Peshawar and was immensely popular amongst everyone. The Afghans, the foreign expats. Remember, at that time, it was all the aid that was going into the Afghan people was going in through Peshawar. So all the aid agencies were there, the UN was there, and then every major country in the West wanted reports from how the war was going against the Soviets and all. So all the diplomats were there. It was also very dangerous because people were being assassinated in Peshawar. And then, of course, by in 1986, the Arabs had arrived in force. They weren't particularly threatening at that time, but it was very interesting to try and find out what they were up to. And it was very difficult to meet the Arabs, particularly, obviously, bin Laden, who was there. But they came to play a very dominant role in the politics of Peshawar. So, Nancy was basically, collecting and archiving all the material that she had collected over the years in Kabul. And of course, all this was to re-emerge later on when she moved her whole archive to Kabul University.
So she went to Afghanistan with Alan Wolf. She married Louis. They were there until the Russians invaded. They fled to Pakistan, and they were there for a long time. And then they came back to the United States, and he took up a professorship at Duke University. And then he died. And finally, after some time, friends of hers urged her to go back to Peshawar because she was just grieving and in no man's land, to go back to Peshawar and pick up on some of the work that Louis and she had started in collecting materials about Afghanistan. This is the archive that eventually became ACKU.
She was kind of in the background. And it's not until after Louis' death, I think, that she really steps out from what I could see on her own. Well, what choice did she have? But she certainly wanted to carry on his legacy in every conceivable way. But her really genuine love for the Afghans was just always evident. And as we know, she dedicated those years, and we're talking about 30 years, that she outlived Louis. And I think that's the most interesting part of her story.
After Nancy returned to Pakistan in the wake of Louis' death in 1989, she continued to build her archival collection. But in 1992, her attention turned to the preservation of the National Museum of Afghanistan in Kabul, which she knew particularly well from writing a guidebook for it in 1974. After the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan in 1989, the Afghan Communist government had held on to power for several more years against the Mujahideen resistance fighters, until 1992 when the government collapsed. The Mujahideen factions then broke out into civil war, and the museum ended up on the front line of the fighting during the early 1990s. At the time, Ahmed Rashid reported on the condition of the museum.
It was a very desperate situation in Afghanistan. At that time, the civil war had been going on. There had been fighting literally outside the Kabul Museum. There had been destruction by both the Taliban and Dostum's forces, the Uzbek forces. And there were real fears that, the whole museum would be looted, robbed, or destroyed. The local Afghan staff played an incredible role, along with the UN, to try and negotiate their independence from the fighting and not to be held hostage by anyone, and also to preserve what was there already.
I sat down with the former director of the National Museum of Afghanistan, Omar Khan Massoudi, to talk about efforts to protect the museum during the Civil War. We met at the Serena Hotel, formerly known as the Kabul Hotel, where Mr. Massoudi had helped store artifacts from the museum for safekeeping during the conflict. His colleague translated for him.
So when they got the permission to visit the National Museum, so there were some journalists at that time with them and the ICRC representatives. So they visited, but they found the National Museum in a very bad situation at that time. Especially the upper floor was totally burned, and the depot or the storages that they used to keep the artifacts there, their doors were broken, and most of the artifacts were looted. So there were some limited number of artifacts that they were burned, but they have lost most of the documentaries, inventory cards for the artifacts, which was on the second floor, and they got burned at that time. So after 2 days, Nancy, in a very harsh winter, came to Kabul and visited the National Museum staffs, and they were trying to protect the remaining artifacts that from demolition and from destructions. After 2 days work and consultations, so they were trying to establish a society for the preservation of Afghan cultural heritage, especially the National Museum artifacts. So everyone knew at that time that it was a very great risk actually going to the west of Kabul at that time, especially during the war. But Nancy, because the love that she had for the Afghan culture and the interest that she was coming to Kabul at the time that there were no hotels, no accommodations, especially the whole city was under the war. But she had the interest for the culture, especially for the artifacts of the National Museum, to preserve them.
I spoke to Jolene Leslie, who worked for the UN in Kabul at the time and was a founding member of SPOTCH, the Society for the Preservation of Afghanistan's Cultural Heritage, about Nancy's role in the organization.
We had this kind of brainwave together with Carla Grisman, we decided to set up an organization. And it was a kind of slightly Janus-faced organization, because on the one hand we had to speak to impressionable diplomats in Islamabad particularly, where the power was because everybody was offshore, and those of us in the field who were actually much more viscerally involved and much more operationally involved had to somehow reconcile the kind of diplomatic side. The government had fallen, there was nothing very much to replace it. So it filled a gap because it wasn't Afghan speaking for themselves necessarily, although there were. I think we all made an effort to try and make sure there was an Afghan voice, so it just wasn't an expat coterie. And as a result of the war and the lack of control over the country, particularly key sites like Herat and Jam and others, and to some extent Balkh, the lid was a little bit off the pot. It didn't always happen, but quite often the Mujahideen then plundered. Many of these sites had been plundered before anyway, but it was particularly intrusive and destructive until, well, for more or less a decade actually, that it was kind of open season. I mean, Nancy, being in Peshawar, actually had a very privileged position because she was able to see, first of all, she had a very good network, but she was also able to see objects passing through, which was much easier to see in Peshawar because the dealers were more concentrated there. And I think she probably had a very good network of Afghans who went and scouted out pieces. So there was both a political vacuum but also a technical vacuum, and SPOTCH tried to fill the latter by actually going out, visiting places, trying to raise awareness about issues and flag wave about, essentially also like a fire alarm, to say we need to be careful, we need to be careful. So I think there was a practical side of it. And then it evolved because we had as it were, a sovereign counterpart, and did some more practical work, more implementation focused on the museum. And I think a lot of the key players who had been heavyweight diplomats in Kabul had moved on as individuals, and they were passionate in their different ways. And that gave us a lot more impetus, thanks to Nancy's extraordinary skills of wooing ambassadors and getting them engaged.
So that was Nancy's main role then, was it, working with the ambassadors and getting support for it?
Yeah, and actually drawing on in a very direct way, as Nancy always was, talking facts and basically saying, I remember because I went there with Louis in the 1960s. And that was very, very useful, because I would always defer to her and say, well, yes, I've been to that site, but I was only there 5 minutes ago, or 3 months ago. What's the deeper story? And she was very, very useful at sort of digging that up.
In 1994, the Taliban movement emerged, which was based on a strict interpretation of Islamic law to challenge the warring Mujahideen factions and restore order to the country based on their religious views. After the Taliban captured the capital in 1996, they continued to fight the Mujahideen forces in the Bamiyan region in central Afghanistan. There, a Taliban commander threatened to destroy the famed Bamiyan Buddhas in 1997 and carried out an attack the following year, damaging the small Buddha statue, despite reassurances from the Taliban leadership that the statues would be protected. Here's the journalist Kathy Gannon about Nancy's efforts to find out about the condition of the Buddhist statues in Afghanistan.
The Kabul airport was closed and we had to fly into Ghazni, and took a bus. It was the Taliban time, and we took a bus up to Kabul, and so it was Nancy and I in the front of the bus. And despite the fact that everybody said, no, you can't sit at the front of the bus, well, Nancy and I looked at each other and said, of course, we're going to sit at the front of the bus. And Nancy was coming, and had been coming, but she was trying to get to Bamiyan. This was long before the Buddhas. I want to say 99, because there was no issue with traveling to see the Buddhas, and there's no issue with, she also went to Ghazni. There was a sleeping Buddha there that the Italians, I think, had done some help restoring. And she spent, I think, maybe 2-3 weeks there then.
I was then in charge of the UN in Kabul, and we had a kind of a brainstorming about how to deal with the looming issue of the Bamiyan Buddhas, because it was kind of on the radar. And she was very, very useful in terms of kind of guiding me about sitting down and saying, the UN needs to be careful not to politicize this. The international community risks actually drawing too much attention to the risks to give, as it were, a trump card to the hardline factions. So they might turn around and say, as a demonstration of their power, this is what we're going to do. And that was quite helpful, because it was something that was in my mind's eye, but to have her huge historical perspective.
Despite protests by Spach and the international community, in March 2001, the Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddha statues and other pre-Islamic statues across the country, including at the National Museum. 2 decades of conflict had devastated the country and its cultural heritage. Following the overthrow of the Taliban in late 2001 by NATO-led forces in response to September 11th, as the international community began to support nation-building in Afghanistan, Nancy was keenly aware of the many challenges facing the preservation of the country's heritage. In an interview with Jolene Leslie shortly before she passed away, Nancy reflected on some of these issues in the post-2001 era.
History has been taught so badly, dates and paper. No illustrations, bad paper, not a textbook that you want to pick up. And then when they went into as refugees, in Iran they got Iranian history and they got Arab history, no Afghan. And in Pakistan they got Pakistani and Arab, no Afghan. So they came back here and they had no sense of belonging. Now, Kabul is a jazzy place, and for a while they were quite happy to be back because it was, a lot going on. But then it became rather ephemeral, and they felt that they didn't belong here, and so many of the young people are trying desperately to get out of here, which is a loss to the work. And they say it's because there are no jobs, which is unfortunately true, and also the security is so bad. But it's more than that. They just don't have a sense of belonging. They don't know their past. They don't know their history. They don't know what their heritage. They don't know how rich their history is. They have not a single clue.
Nancy was never short of ideas about how to tackle the many challenges facing Afghanistan's heritage and education of the younger generation. Here's Laura Tedesco, U.S. Cultural Attaché, on one of these ideas.
I remember asking Nancy for just give us your ideas. What would be some useful things to do in the cultural preservation sector this was concurrent with the security situation really starting to decline, like 2013, 2014, 2015. And Nancy had the brilliant idea of creating a kind of museum on wheels and somehow creating a curriculum around what's in the National Museum about Afghanistan's much more diverse heritage than is taught officially in school curriculums, and introducing young students, like middle school and high school age students, to some topics that they may not have been exposed to.
We have a number of grants that we've been doing, but one of the most significant ones is something called the Mobile Museum Outreach Project.
Here's Gil Stein, archaeologist from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago.
And it turns out that Nancy was the animating force behind this. I'll say the irresistible animating force behind that she single-handedly persuaded the State Department to fund a project where the whole idea was to educate Afghan high school students about the cultural heritage of Afghanistan, and especially to bring the National Museum out to the people, because it's obviously it's a free museum for Afghans, and it is the treasure house of basically the most important objects that encapsulate or tell the story of the development of civilizations in Afghanistan is in that museum. And it's incredibly important stuff that most people in the world don't even know about. But a big part of the problem is that Afghans can't even get to the museum. If you're outside of Kabul and you're a high school student, it's not like some kid in America being able to do a school trip to visit the Smithsonian. And so what we did was we made 3D replicas of artifacts from the museum, and then we developed an in-school program with Afghan instructors, and we reached something like 90 schools, basically the entire Kabul school district. We did programs in every school. And then we went out to all the major cities in Afghanistan, and they loved it.
And by all accounts, it's been quite well received. It's interactive. There's these 3D replicas of artifacts that students get to handle and feel the texture of. They're not actual artifacts. They're just facsimiles, but when you can handle something and hold something and feel the size of it in your hand and the texture of it, it brings something to life in a kind of pedagogical way that's not typical for the typical Afghan pedagogy, which is much less interactive. So I would say that it was based on Nancy's idea that it was one of the most successful cultural preservation projects that the U.S. Embassy ever supported. And it wasn't millions of dollars. It began as a modest idea, which is so classic for Nancy. I mean, she was able to get at the heart of issues so efficiently. So it started as a very modest idea, and the impact was, I think, quite powerful.
Preservation of information. Now, this is very important because it's not very well developed here. And that's one of the reasons for ACKU, my center. I'm collecting the things that everybody is working all the research that's being done now. Because usually what happens with these big agencies, they bring a reporter or a consultant, pay them big money, and they write a report, and they circulate it for a short time, and then it disappears. We collect, or try to collect, all the reporting that's being generated by the NGOs, by the bilateral governments, by the UN agencies, anything that describes what is going on, what is the situation here in Afghanistan. And the reason we do this is because I'm convinced that if you give the people of Afghanistan access to the information they need, that they themselves will do 80% of all this very expensive development.
I've come to the Afghanistan Center at Kabul University, ACKU, to talk to the director Wahid Wafa, who's carrying on Nancy's work. So we're here during COVID, but I've been here in the past where this place is absolutely buzzing. Can you just talk a little bit about what people come here to do?
To be honest, still this center is a place that every seconds that we are talking, somebody is in it that we don't know. I mean, currently we see around 250,000 people are going to all these platforms that we have. But during the summer, you see hundreds of students all around. And she was right when she and I were fundraising for the remaining part of this building. She was telling a donor, I can remember, that look, one day I will invite you to a beautiful place that will have a flow of young, bright and beautiful people there. And you can't find a space. And that was true. I mean, when we launched this building, the next day, hundreds of students were around us. I mean, still, if you come to during the summer, spring, despite this COVID, despite all these violence in this country, so this iconic building is a place for pictures outside, Hundreds of students are outside while dozens are inside working. But her legacy is getting very strong by this digitization project that people are visiting this center online every day.
After speaking to Wahid, I've come to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kabul to interview former President of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, who I've been told formed a close friendship with Nancy. I've read that you were quite involved in ACKU and helping her, inviting her to bring her documents back, and also you helped with funding to find the building.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us a bit about why you felt like getting involved?
From childhood, especially from my teenage years, in the regular household talks, I used to hear the elders of the family, my uncles and others who were at the university at the time or who were at the foreign service at the time, talk about her, about Louis Dupree and Nancy Dupree and what they were doing. Of course, as teenagers, you just hear without much curiosity into things. So there was that familiarity about the couple who worked in Afghanistan and who did a lot on Afghan archaeology and the riches of our museums and all that. That familiarity was there, and then also while we were in the resistance in Peshawar, I did very often come across her work, and that she was busy there and that she was working. This is after her husband passed away as well. She remained lovingly committed to Afghanistan and the good causes of our heritage and of our archaeological sites or national monuments. So when we all arrived in Afghanistan, when I became the head of the government during my time in office, one of the most pleasant experiences of my time in office was getting together with her and talking about things and listening to her, to tell her us things. And when she came up with the idea of the resource center at the Kabul University, I was so happy. And at the stroke of a second, I said, right, we'll find you the funds. And we did that. And she built a good site there, a nice building, quite good. So it was in many ways, in very profound ways, I should say, in very profound ways, a tremendous honor to have known her, to have worked with her, to have been in a very, 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 very minutely small way part of her endeavors for Afghanistan. And I'm glad talking to you about all this and this grand lady of the country.
It's interesting you bring up hearing about her. So many people that I've spoken to always want to tell stories about Nancy.
Mm-hmm.
Nancy was
so many people have stories about Nancy.
Yes, exactly. Nancy was a great storyteller.
Yes,
and
yes.
She lived a very colorful life. Do you have any particular story with Nancy that you like to tell her?
Well, lots of stories. She treated us like youngsters. That was great. She would come into the office and sit down, tell me, and do this and do this, and why haven't you done this? You're not been a good boy. Well, that was great. That was very, very nice.
Do you think that helped make her effective at what she accomplished quite a lot?
She accomplished a lot. Look at the dedication that she had for our country and for culture, for not only for culture and the relics of Afghanistan, but also for the future generations. When during the Taliban, when the schools were closed, she opened up, sort of libraries and material for children and for the education of children. So it was she did all she could with all the endeavors that a human being can afford to keep us a living cultural society.
President Karzai was far from the only political figure Nancy persuaded to support her causes. Here's Sandra Cook again, talking about Nancy's talent for swaying people.
We wanted to raise some money in the United States. The Dupree Foundation was specifically formed to raise money in the United States, and we had a 501c3, so anybody who donated could take a tax deduction. So we set up this thing for her on Capitol Hill, and it could have been in the Senate building, but somebody set up Richard Holbrooke to come to this affair, and there were really important people there. I mean, he was just one of all these people who came to hear her talk. People from the Army and all the services, people from Capitol Hill, senators, etc. So she gave her talk, and there she is, this little bird, giving her talk. And she said, and she talked about ACKU, and she said, so we did this, we collected this archive. And then she said, but that was not enough. We wanted to do more for the Afghan people. So we started writing these books, and she talked about the ABLE program. And she said, but even that was not enough and everything. So she gave this endearing little talk. And after she spoke, Richard Holbrooke, he walked up to the podium and he said, we have got to do something here. And we managed to raise $2 million from USAID through his influence.
What would you say Nancy's legacy is in Afghanistan? How do you want people to remember her?
Well, she's remembered very fondly. She's remembered lovingly by those who are aware of her work, generally. But the educated lot of the country and those who have lived at that time all know her, without exception. So she is a household name in the country, very, very much. And one that we don't consider her anymore an American. We consider her an Afghan, and we are proud of her being from the soil, and we treat her as one of our greatest.
Well, as far as, educated Afghans are concerned, I mean, she will never be forgotten.
Here's Ahmed Rashid again.
Because she restored their dignity, their history, their pride in their own country and their people by, keeping such voluminous archives, which are now available in Kabul University. The problem now is that, remember, Kabul University was a shooting ground at the time of the Civil War, and it could become once again, because Kabul University was the Taliban considered it a major threat to because it produced educated people who were specialists, etc. And we could see again fighting around the Kabul University and the looting of various things in Kabul. And of course, now there's an American Afghan university in Kabul also, which has been attacked. And we've seen professors being kidnapped from there. We've seen people being killed there. So it's not that much has changed. The disrespect that the Taliban had for education in the 90s is once again being repeated. And really, I mean, Nancy's legacy is giving the Afghans a sense of their own history and pride. And she was dealing with not just the old, the archaeological remains that were so historic, so many civilizations that passed through Kabul in Afghanistan, but how that would create modern Afghans who were part of the global community.
Here's Ambassador Newman, one of the AMBIs, as Nancy used to like to call ambassadors, who served in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2007.
You have these targeted assassinations now at the whole intellectual strata of Afghanistan. And so I think the first and foremost need, of course, will be for Afghan women to be the lead, the exemplars. But somebody like Nancy, who believed in Afghanistan and believed in women, I think is at least the kind of example that's still awfully useful today. She was, and I hope still will be, such a beacon to Afghan women of what women can achieve in Afghanistan. And you have, as I'm sure you know from being there, an incredible number of really dynamic, impressive women.
Here's Kathy Gannon again.
I think for Nancy, Afghanistan was both a love letter to Louis. It was a continuation of her passion for Louis, but it was also her real passion for Afghanistan and for the next generation, for each next generation. I mean, this wasn't something that she just most recently would say. Even I remember in the 90s and in the early 2000s, the new generation just doesn't know. They don't know their heritage. They don't know their the real depth of their culture. And for her, this was one of the most important reasons for what she did was trying to educate and preserve for each successive generation the real treasures that was there in Afghanistan and that were theirs to take pride in. And I remember her saying that in one of our last conversations, is I want to finish this because I want them to take pride in this. This is where, that their pride should stem from. And she was really very passionate about it. And I know the center is such a gift of Nancy's to Afghanistan and to successive generations. So yeah, pretty remarkable.
On my last morning in Kabul, I went with Wahid Wafa to Baghi Bala to visit Louise and Nancy's memorial. The palace was a fitting resting place. Built by the Afghan emir in the 1890s, it had been home to the Royal Cabinet of Curiosities that would one day form the National Museum, before the palace was transformed into a high-end restaurant where Louis and Nancy were married.
This is actually a stone that and a place that Nancy brought the ashes of Louis, but it was very secret. Few people knew about it.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit also scared of the security of this stone, although it's just a stone. But when Nancy died, we put her name also beside Louis Dupree. You know. This side, it's the Farsi, and it says that Khatri dost dashtani. So in the other side is the English, in loving memory, Nancy Hatch Dupree, 1927-2017, and Louis Dupree, 1925-1989. So it was done by Nancy herself.
Why did Nancy decide to put him here?
Because I think they married here in this palace, this small restaurant. And she loved the place and the view, and probably Louis Dupree also loved the place. So, and Louis Dupree and Nancy both loved the kind of flower that you can find around here. So I don't know the name in English, but it's arghawan. And most probably the time that Nancy put this stone here, so these trees were smaller, and you could see everywhere from here. And as I told you, she was saying, hey, Louis has got a beautiful view.
And it is, it's an amazing view of this part of the city, isn't it?
Yeah, you can see most part of the city from here, the north part and also the east part of the city.
With the snow-covered mountaintops in the background.
Yeah. I think she's happy with that.
Out of this, we must see some leadership. We must look to the young people. Find a direction, find a leader to lead us in that direction.